Now, before I tell you what I found, I need to take a step backward because this story doesn't start with a policy. It doesn't start with construction. It doesn't start with artificial intelligence. And it doesn't start with a business plan. It starts with my parents. Like many families, ours eventually found itself facing realities we didn't particularly want to face. My mother's health began to decline, and my father was aging. New challenges were appearing, and the future was becoming less predictable than it once seemed. If you've experienced that with your own parents, you know exactly what I'm talking about. There comes a point when the conversation changes, the concerns change, the priorities change, and the questions change. You're no longer asking what somebody wants to do next year. You're asking how to help them maintain quality of life right now. You're asking how to preserve independence, how to preserve dignity. You're asking how to help people remain in the place they most want to be, which is their home. Hey, everybody, my name is Eric Myers, and if I'm being completely honest with you, I've never done a podcast before. Just as an FYI, for those of you who know me personally, you know that I don't usually have a hard time going off script. I love storytelling, and I can usually find my words, and I usually can explain what I mean. I usually do that with a fair amount of confidence, but this is different. This is my first podcast, and this is the culmination of 2.5 years of effort, thought, research, work, frustration, discovery, and conviction being put together all at one time for somebody else to finally see and to judge. So yes, I'm reluctantly using a teleprompter, not because I don't know what I want to say. I'm using it because I want to make sure I get the foundational parts across clearly. I want to stay out of the rabbit holes that I love so dearly, and I want to avoid drifting into off-topic discussion. And even though that can be fun, it can also be very inefficient. This subject matters too much to me to casually wing the first explanation. Some of what I'm going to talk about includes definitions, some of it includes details, some of it includes descriptions that I want to say clearly at least once. Every word I'm reading has been reviewed, approved, and shaped line by line from my own thoughts, my own experience, and my own story. So if my eyes look like they're reading, it's because they are. But I'm not reading something disconnected from me. I'm reading what I believe. I'm reading what I have lived, and I'm reading it this way because I want you to be able to follow the thought clearly. I don't have a big audience. I don't have a following. I don't have sponsors. I don't have clout, swagger, or any reason to assume that most people know who I am or what I've been working on. Unless somebody shared this with you, you probably have no reason to know who I am either, and that is perfectly okay. But I do believe that if you stay with me long enough during this podcast, something that I say in this conversation will connect with you personally. Because what I'm talking about is not limited to one kind of person. It's not limited to one kind of family, and it's not limited to one stage of life. At some point, every family has to deal with change. And that's where this begins. What I do have is a project that I have devoted the last 2.5 years of my life to building. And I believe it matters. I believe it matters because it sits at the intersection of something every family eventually encounters: change. Not the kind of change we talk about in business, not the kind of change we talk about in politics. I'm talking about life change, the kind that shows up whether you invited it or not. A diagnosis, an injury, a surgery, a child with special needs, an aging parent, a spouse whose health begins to change, a temporary setback that becomes a permanent reality. Life has a way of changing the plan. And over the last few years, I found myself thinking about that more than I ever expected. Now, before I go any further, I should probably tell you a little bit about myself. My background is unusual. I have a bachelor's degree in healthcare administration from the University of Kentucky, and I have a master's degree in business administration from Morehead State University. I've spent more than 30 years working in and around healthcare at an executive level. And at that same time, I've spent years in construction, residential construction, commercial construction. I've built medical office buildings, surgical facilities, hospitals. I've spent a lot of my life standing with one foot in healthcare and one foot in construction. For the most of that time, those two worlds felt separate, related maybe, but separate. Then something happened. Actually, a lot of things happened. My mother's health began to decline. My father began facing challenges of his own. And our family started experiencing some of the same realities that millions of Americans experience every day. And like many sons, I started looking for answers. I started asking questions. What resources exist? What programs exist? What help exists? What can be done to help people remain safe, independent, functional inside the place they most want to be? their home. At the time, I wasn't trying to build a company. I wasn't trying to create a movement. I wasn't trying to create a standard. I was trying to solve a problem. Actually, I was trying to solve several problems. And the more I looked, the more I noticed something. There were incredible healthcare professionals. There were accessibility professionals. There were occupational therapists. There were contractors. There were remodelers. There were architects. There were designers. There were government programs. But something felt disconnected. Something felt incomplete. Everybody seemed to be working on a piece of the problem, yet nobody appeared to be connecting all of the pieces together, at least not in a way that made sense to me. Healthcare seemed to be looking at healthcare. Construction seemed to be looking at construction. Accessibility seemed to be looking at accessibility. Government programs staring at themselves, to no surprise. But very few people appeared to be looking at all of them at the same time. Looking back, that realization led to the development of XAiQ, what I describe as an AI-powered strategic intelligence engine. At the time, I certainly wasn't trying to build an AI platform, and I wasn't trying to invent anything. I wasn't trying to become an AI expert either. I was simply trying to understand a problem that seemed too much and too big and much more complicated than anyone was talking about. So the deeper I dug, the more information I found. Healthcare information, construction information, accessibility information, government information, demographic information, research studies, population trends, caregiving realities, policy language, insurance language, economic data, public health data, Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services data, census data, and eventually I found myself staring at an enormous number of variables that all appeared to influence one another. The challenge wasn't finding the information. The challenge was organizing the information, connecting information, evaluating information, and understanding relationships between variables that don't normally live in the same conversation. That's where XAiQ began to emerge. Not all at once, but gradually, almost accidentally, and that's a literal statement. Over thousands of hours of research, questioning, testing, refining, organizing, and reorganizing information using open-sourced artificial intelligence as a tool, I began using a framework that could help me organize complexity at a scale that would have been nearly impossible for a single person to manage manually. Over time, that framework evolved into what is now called XAiQ. XAiQ, America's Variable Adaptive Intelligence Quotient, or XAiQ for short. But more importantly, XAiQ is an AI-powered strategic intelligence engine designed to help organize, evaluate, and understand the thousands of variables that influence safety, independence, functionality, adaptability, caregiving, environmental design, and long-term residential decision-making. The name itself reflects the goal. Variable because every family is different. Every home is different. Every diagnosis is different. Every caregiver is different. Every circumstance is different. Adaptive because life changes. Needs change. Families change. Homes change. And the most effective solutions are often the ones that can adapt alongside those changes. Intelligence because understanding those relationships requires information, analysis, pattern recognition, and thoughtful decision-making. And quotient, because ultimately, the goal is to better understand the relationships between thousands of interconnected variables that influence how people live inside their own homes. The more information available, the more precise the analysis can become. And when you're trying to understand how healthcare, construction, aging, disability, caregiving, risk reduction, environmental design, government policy, and demographic change all interact with one another, precision matters. What started as an effort to help my own personal family eventually evolved into something much larger, a framework and a methodology, and ultimately a proprietary patent-pending framework designed to help people think about their homes differently. We'll spend a lot more time talking about XAiQ later. For now, just understand that it became one of the tools that helped me connect pieces that otherwise seemed disconnected. So I kept digging and I kept asking and I kept learning. Eventually, I stumbled across information coming out of CMS, Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, and Medicare Advantage programs discussing environmental supports and home modifications. And that caught my attention. Not because I thought the government had suddenly solved a problem, but because it revealed something important. Healthcare was beginning to recognize that the environment around us matters. The home matters. The layout matters. The design matters. The little things matter. And once I saw that, I couldn't stop seeing it. I started noticing things quite literally everywhere. I'd walk into a home and notice a doorway. I would notice a hallway. I would notice a bathroom layout. I would notice lighting or storage or the lack thereof. I would notice cabinet placement or stairs, transitions between rooms. I would notice most things people never think about, not because I was trying to criticize them, because I was trying to understand them. I started realizing that many of the things that become problems later in life aren't necessarily expensive problems. Sometimes they're design problems. Sometimes they're planning problems. Sometimes they're simply things nobody thought about early enough problems. And the more I studied it, the more one question kept showing up. Will this home still work when life changes? Not if life changes, when. Because life always changes, sometimes gradually, sometimes overnight, sometimes in ways we expect, thank God, but sometimes in ways we never saw coming. That question eventually became the foundation for what I now call safe sizing. Now, when people hear that name, they often assuming we're talking about accessibility. And accessibility is certainly part of the conversation, but safe sizing is bigger than that. It's about utility, it's about functionality, it's about adaptability, it's about thoughtful decisions made early enough that they provide options later. It's about what I often call purposeful environmental considerations. And over the next several episodes, we're going to unpack all of that. We're going to talk about healthcare. We're going to talk about construction. We're going to talk about families. We're going to talk about caregiving. We're going to talk about autism. We're going to talk about special needs. We're going to talk about aging. We're going to talk about independence. We're going to talk about freedom. We're going to talk about why homes matter far more than most people realize. But before we do any of that, I think we need to start somewhere simpler because safe sizing can sound abstract. And honestly, definitions only take you so far. The reality is that this idea didn't start in a boardroom. It didn't start with a marketing plan. It didn't start with a business strategy. It started with people that I loved, people I worried about, the people that I wanted to help. And if I'm honest, that's what this is still about today. People, families, real life. So before I try to define safe sizing any further, it's probably easier for me to show you what safe sizing means than it is for me to define it. Safe Sizing, podcast episode 1, section 1. Ha! So before I try to define safe sizing any further, it's probably easier for me to show you what safe sizing means than it is to define it. Let me show you what I mean. Let's start with something that nobody ever sees. A piece of dimensional lumber inside a wall. That's it, a piece of wood. No fancy technology, no artificial intelligence, no expensive equipment, no miracle product. Just a piece of dimensional lumber, 2 by 6 by 10 or 12 or 8 or whatever. Most people have no reason to think about what's inside their walls. And honestly, most of the time they shouldn't have to. But let's imagine something. Let's imagine you're building a home today. You're healthy, you're active, everything is going great. Now imagine someone asks you a simple question. Would you like the ability to install a grab bar in this bathroom 20 years from now if you ever needed one? And most people would probably say, sure. But the next question is, would you rather spend a few dollars today preparing for that possibility or hundreds or thousands of dollars later opening walls, repairing drywall, repainting, and trying to figure out what is behind the surface? Most people answer that question pretty quickly. That's what I mean by planning ahead, and that's what I mean by preserving options. That hidden piece of blocking, that 2 by 6 by whatever, behind a bathroom wall may never get used, and that's perfectly fine. The point isn't that you'll need it. The point is that you can. The option exists. The flexibility exists. The wall is prepared. Nobody sees it. Nobody talks about it, but it matters. Now let's move into the kitchen. Before anybody gets nervous, I'm not going to tell you that everybody needs a special cabinet set or whatever. I'm actually going to tell you almost the opposite. Let's say somebody wants a lower countertop because of a wheelchair or because of stature or because of a specific physical limitation. That may be the perfect solution for that family. But what happens if that need changes? What happens if the home changes? Ownership. What happens if a future buyer has different needs? What happens if circumstances evolve? One of the questions safe sizing asks is can we preserve future flexibility without sacrificing present desirability? Sometimes the answer is yes. Sometimes there are ways to prepare for future possibilities without permanently locking the home into a single solution. Again, we're not talking about right or wrong. We're talking about options. We're talking about flexibility. We're talking about understanding that life changes. Now let's talk about lighting. And I know that sounds boring. Lighting does not exactly make headlines, and it's actually hard just to make it sound exciting in a podcast. But nobody gathers around dinner tables talking about light switches. But think about how many times you've walked through your house at night. Think about how many times you've carried groceries inside. Think about how many times you've walked to the bathroom half asleep. Think about how many times you've looked for your keys or your cell phone while you're talking on it. Good lighting helps. Bad lighting creates problems. Not dramatic problems, usually not. Just small frustrations, small inconveniences, small risks. The kind that slowly add up over time, a light switch that makes sense, a pathway that's illuminated, a darker corner that becomes visible. These aren't exciting design decisions, they're practical decisions, and practical decisions often matter more than exciting ones. Now let's talk about doorways, because doorways are one of the easiest examples to understand. People think very little about doorways unless they're being forced to listen to it on a podcast. Until it becomes necessary, until somebody breaks a leg, until somebody needs a walker, until somebody uses a wheelchair, until furniture won't fit through the front door, you can't pivot, or until a hospital bed shows up, until life changes. Suddenly that doorway everybody ignored becomes very important. And here's the interesting thing. Many of these decisions are dramatically easier when considered early, not because they're expensive, because they're simple. Simple before construction, much harder afterward. That's a pattern you'll hear repeatedly through this podcast. Simple before, complicated after. Now let's zoom out. Let's start talking about individual features and start talking about layouts. Because layouts affect everything. How far do you walk from the bedroom to the bathroom? How many turns do you make? How easy is it for you to carry laundry through the house? How easy is it to bring groceries inside? How easy is it to remove or move from one space to another? How much effort does everyday life require? Again, none of these questions sound dramatic, but life is often lived inside ordinary moments. Not extraordinary ones, ordinary moments. The trip from the bedroom to the bathroom, the trip from the garage to the kitchen, the trip to get the mail, the trip to answer the door, the trip to turn off a light. Thousands and thousands of ordinary moments. Safe sizing pays attention to those moments, not because we're trying to eliminate life, because we're trying to create some kind of sterile environment. Quite the opposite. We're trying to make life easier to live. We're trying to make homes work better for the people who live inside them. And that's where a phrase you'll hear me use often comes into the conversation. Purposeful environmental considerations. Now, that's a fancy phrase for a very simple idea. The environment affects behavior. The environment affects safety, and the environment affects independence. The environment affects convenience. The environment affects stress. The environment affects quality of life. Whether we realize it or not, the environment is always participating. A step participates, a doorway participates, a cabinet participates, lighting participates, storage participates, layout participates. The home itself participates. And once you begin looking at homes through that lens, you start seeing things differently. You stop asking, what does this house look like? And you start asking, how does this house work? Will this impress somebody during an open house? And you start asking, will this support somebody during real life? And that brings us back to the heart of safe sizing. Not fear, not disability, not aging, not limitations. Function, utility, flexibility, options. The ability to adapt when life inevitably changes. And most of the time, those opportunities don't come from massive changes. They come from small moves, early moves, 2x6s. Quiet moves, the kind of decisions that nobody notices when they're made, and oftentimes they get skimmed over, but everybody appreciates when they're needed. And now that you've seen a few examples, let's talk about what safe sizing actually is. So now that you've seen a few examples, let's talk about what safe sizing actually is. Because at some point, every conversation reaches the same question: what is it? And honestly, that's a fair question. I've spent the last couple of sections talking about doorways, layouts, lighting, cabinets, blocking inside walls, and purposeful environmental considerations. But none of those things by themselves are safe sizing. They're examples, they're illustrations, they're pieces of a much larger picture. So let's start with the simplest definition I can give you. Here we go. Safe sizing is the practice of improving utility, safety, functionality, and adaptability through thoughtful residential design, construction, and remodeling decisions. That's it. At least that's the simple version. Now let's unpack that a little bit because there are 4 words in that definition that matter: utility, safety, functionality, and adaptability. Let's start with utility. When I say utility, I don't mean electricity or water. I don't mean gas service. I mean usefulness. Does the home work for the people who live there? Can they accomplish daily tasks efficiently? Can they move through the environment comfortably? Can they use the spaces the way those spaces were intended to be used? Utility is about usefulness. A beautiful home that doesn't work well for the people living inside it may still be beautiful, but it isn't necessarily useful. Safe sizing asks us to consider both. So let's talk about safety. And safety is one of those words that can accidentally create the wrong impression, because when many people hear the word safety, they immediately think danger. And that's not what I'm talking about at all. I'm talking about risk, and more specifically, unnecessary and potentially avoidable risk. Life comes with enough unavoidable risk as it is. Nobody gets to avoid all of it. And we can't prevent every injury. We can't prevent every diagnosis. We can't prevent every accident, but we can often reduce it, sometimes significantly. A better transition, a better layout, a better lighting plan, a better pathway, a better design decision, small improvements, meaningful outcomes. Safety is not about creating a perfectly safe home. There is no such thing. It's about reducing unavoidable risk wherever practical. Now let's talk about functionality, because functionality is where things start becoming personal. Functionality asks a very simple question: can the people who live here successfully perform the activities of daily life? Can they cook? Can they clean? Can they bathe? Can they move throughout the home? Can they enter and exit safely? Can they accomplish ordinary tasks? Again, we're not talking about perfection. We're talking about support. The home should support the people living inside it, not work against them. Now let's talk about adaptability, because adaptability is really where safe sizing begins, separating itself from many traditional conversations. Adaptability recognizes something very simple: people change, families change, circumstances change, needs change, life changes. A home that works perfectly for a family today may not work perfectly 10 years from now. A home that works perfectly for a young couple may not work perfectly after children arrive. A home that works perfectly before surgery may not work perfectly after surgery. A home that works perfectly before a diagnosis may not work perfectly afterwards. Adaptability asks, how difficult will it be for this home to adjust when life changes? That's the question. Not whether change will happen. It's how prepared are we when it does? And that leads us to one of the most important questions in the entire safe sizing framework. Will this home still work when life changes? Not if, when. Because change is undefeated. Eventually, every family encounters it. Now, one of the things I want to be careful about is what safe sizing is not. Safe sizing is not just aging in place, although aging is certainly part of the conversation. Safe sizing is not just accessibility, although accessibility is certainly part of the conversation. Safe sizing is not just disability, although disability is certainly part of the conversation. And safe sizing is not just remodeling, and it's not just new construction. Safe sizing is a way of evaluating the relationship between people and the environments they live in. That's why I often say that safe sizing sits at the intersection of healthcare and residential construction, because healthcare spends a tremendous amount of time studying people. Construction spends a tremendous amount of time creating environments. Safe sizing asks, what happens when those two worlds begin talking to each other? What happens when healthcare observations influence design decisions? What happens when construction decisions support long term functionality? And what happens when we intentionally connect those dots? That's where things start becoming interesting. And that's also where the conversation starts expanding beyond aging. Because once you begin to look through this lens, you realize something. This isn't just about older adults. This isn't just about retirement. This isn't just about wheelchairs. This isn't just about healthcare. This is about people with disabilities or with different abilities. Excuse me. Apologize. I needed to take a drink there. Very nervous. My mouth is dry. But different circumstances, different needs, different challenges, different goals, different families. And once you realize, the conversation becomes much bigger than most people expect, because adaptability is not about one diagnosis. It's not about one age group, and it's not about one season of life. Adaptability is about life itself, and that's exactly where we're headed next. Adaptability is not about one diagnosis. It's not about one age group. It's not about one season of life. Adaptability is about life itself. And that's exactly where we're headed next, because one of the biggest misconceptions people have when they first hear about safe sizing is that they assume we're only talking about aging. And I understand why. Aging is often the first example to think about. But the truth is, life is much more complicated than that. Real life doesn't arrive one category at a time. Real life shows up all at once, and I am an expert in that. Sometimes it's an aging parent. Sometimes it's a child with special needs. Sometimes it's a spouse dealing with health challenges. Sometimes it's a temporary injury. Sometimes it's a permanent disability. Sometimes it's a veteran returning home. Sometimes it's a family trying to navigate circumstances they never expected. And sometimes it's several of those things happening at the same time. Life rarely asks permission before it changes. It simply changes. And families adapt. At least they try to. One of the things I've learned over the years is that every family has a story. Some stories are visible, some aren't. Some challenges are obvious the moment you walk through the front door. Others remain invisible for years. And those invisible challenges are often the ones that teach us the most. Take autism, for example. Many people hear the word autism and immediately begin thinking about physical limitations. But in many cases, the challenge isn't physical at all. Sometimes the challenge is executive function. Sometimes the challenge is organization. Sometimes the challenge is sequencing tasks. Sometimes the challenge is managing daily routines. Sometimes the challenge is just navigating an environment that was never designed with those realities in mind. The person may be physically capable of doing many things, but the challenge is often entirely different. And that's an important lesson, because it teaches us that functionality is not always about strength. It's not always about mobility. It's not always about physical capability. Sometimes it's about how people interact with their environment. And once you begin to look at homes through that lens, you start seeing things differently. The same principle applies to families caring for someone with Down syndrome or traumatic brain injuries or developmental disabilities or cognitive challenges or chronic illnesses or mental health conditions. Every family experiences those realities differently, but the common thread is adaptation. Families are constantly adapting, constantly adjusting, constantly finding ways to make life work. Sometimes formally, sometimes creatively, sometimes through pure determination. The environment often becomes a part of that adaptation, whether anyone realizes it or not. Now let's talk about something else: temporary injuries. Sprained ankle for something. Because this is where many people suddenly recognize themselves. You don't need a lifelong diagnosis to understand adaptability. Break a leg, have a surgery, use crutches for 6 weeks, tear a ligament, recover from an accident, spend a few months with limited mobility. Suddenly things you never noticed became very noticeable. A step, a narrow doorway, a difficult bathroom layout, a long walk from the garage, a lack of handholds. The environment hasn't changed, you have. And that temporary change alters your relationship with the home. That's adaptability. Now let's talk about veterans, because veterans often carry realities that aren't immediately visible. Sometimes physical, sometimes cognitive, sometimes emotional, sometimes all of the above. And just like every other group we've discussed, the environment can either support independence or create unnecessary obstacles. Again, the conversation isn't about limitations, the conversation is about support. How does the environment help people succeed? That's the question. So let's talk about caregivers, because caregivers are often the invisible participants in every conversation about housing. And if you've ever been a caregiver, you already know this. The environment doesn't only affect the person receiving care, it affects the person providing it. The spouse, the son, the daughter, the parent, the sibling, the friend, caregiver. A poor layout creates work, and a poor layout creates stress, fatigue, and those effects accumulate over time, sometimes for years, sometimes for decades. The environment is never neutral. It's always helping, or it's always creating friction. Most of the time, we simply don't notice it until life becomes difficult. That's one of the reasons I wanted Adria to be a part of this conversation. Adria is my wife, because she brings a perspective that is different from mine. My background combines healthcare and construction. Her background is healthcare. Excuse me. And perhaps more importantly, as Dr. Adria Myers, nurse practitioner, she'll tell you that healthcare professionals often see realities that builders never encounter. Not because builders aren't paying attention, because they're looking through a different lens. Healthcare professionals see what happens after the diagnosis, after the injury, after the hospitalization, after the discharge, after life changes. And those observations matter because they reveal patterns. They reveal challenges. They reveal opportunities that most people never see. At the same time, Adria and I are not discussing these things from a distance. We're discussing them as parents. We're discussing them as a family. We're discussing them as people who have experienced caregiving responsibilities ourselves. That matters, because this conversation is not theoretical, it's personal, and that's true for millions of families. Every family eventually encounters a moment when life becomes more complicated, maybe temporarily, maybe permanently, maybe unexpectedly, but eventually it happens. And when it does, adaptability becomes incredibly important. Not because adaptability solves every problem, it doesn't, but because adaptability creates options, and options matter, especially when life becomes difficult. The more I've studied this topic, the more I've come to believe that adaptability is ultimately about preserving independence whenever possible, preserving dignity whenever possible, preserving freedom whenever possible. And that applies to far more people than most of us realize, which brings us to another important question. If life changes in so many different ways, how do we create solutions that remain flexible enough to change with it? And that's where we're going with the next conversation. This is more fun than I thought it was going to be. Terrifying. These opportunities exist if healthcare is recognizing them, and if families are experiencing them, and if construction can address them, then why wasn't there already a framework connecting all of those pieces together? That became impossible to ignore, and it ultimately led to a discovery that changed everything. Now, before I tell you what I found, I need to take a step backward, because this story doesn't start with a policy. It doesn't start with construction. It doesn't start with artificial intelligence, and it doesn't start with a business plan. It starts with my parents. Like many families, ours eventually found itself facing realities we didn't particularly want to face. My mother's health began to decline, and my father was aging. New challenges were appearing, and the future was becoming less predictable than it once seemed. If you've experienced that with your own parents, you know exactly what I'm talking about. There comes a point when the conversation changes, the concerns change, the priorities change, and the questions change. You're no longer asking what somebody wants to do next year. You're asking how to help them maintain quality of life right now. You're asking how to preserve independence, how to preserve dignity. You're asking how to help people remain in the place they most want to be, which is their home. And that's where my search began, not as a contractor, not as a business owner, not as somebody trying to create a framework, as a son. I was trying to understand what resources existed, what programs existed, what options existed. Surely somebody had already solved this problem. Surely there had to be systems in place. Surely there had to be support available. So I started researching. I started reading and digging through information. And eventually I came across something that caught my attention big time. CMS, the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services. Now, for most people, that probably doesn't sound particularly exciting. It certainly didn't sound exciting to me at first. But the deeper I looked, the more interesting it became. Because in 2019, CMS expanded the ability of Medicare Advantage plans to provide certain supplemental benefits that addressed health-related needs beyond traditional medical care. And among these, or those discussions, were environmental supports and home-related modifications. And when I saw that, I stopped because something immediately stood out. Healthcare was beginning to recognize something I had never seen acknowledged quite this way before. The home itself matters, not just the person, not just the diagnosis, not just the treatment plan, the environment, the place where daily life actually occurs, the place where people sleep, the place where they recover, the place where they cook meals, the place where they navigate ordinary life, the home. That realization hit me harder than I expected because suddenly I wasn't looking at housing and healthcare as separate conversations anymore. I was seeing overlap. I was seeing intersection. I was seeing connection. And once I saw it, I couldn't stop seeing it. The home wasn't just a shelter. The home wasn't just real estate. The home wasn't just construction. The home was becoming part of the healthcare equation. And not because somebody said it explicitly, because they didn't, because the logic became impossible to ignore. If the environment affects safety, if the environment affects independence, if the environment affects recovery, if the environment affects caregiving, then the environment matters. And if the environment matters, then construction matters, design matters, layout matters, function matters. The more I followed that train of thought, the more I began asking questions. Why are healthcare professionals identifying these needs? Why are families struggling with these realities? Why are contractors being asked to solve these problems? Why are architects and designers encountering these situations? And perhaps most importantly, why was everybody speaking different languages? Healthcare had its terminology. Construction had its terminology. Accessibility had its terminology. Government programs had their terminology, but nobody seemed to be connecting all of those conversations into one coherent framework. There was something was sitting in the gap. That's the best way I know how to describe it. Something was sitting in the gap between healthcare and construction, between diagnosis and design, between caregiving and contracting, between what families needed and what the marketplace was providing. And the more I studied it, the more obvious that gap became. At first, I assumed I simply hadn't found the answer yet. So I did a lot of math. Surely somebody had already connected these dots. Surely somebody had already built a comprehensive residential framework around adaptability. Surely somebody had already organized the concepts into a practical system. So I kept looking. And I kept looking, and I kept looking, and months turned into years. I reviewed research. I reviewed government data. I reviewed healthcare information. I reviewed construction practices, accessibility concepts, aging in place concepts, universal design concepts. And the more I reviewed, the more realization continued emerging. There were more pieces everywhere, excellent pieces, valuable pieces, important pieces. But the complete framework I was looking for didn't appear to exist. Not in the form I expected, not in a way that connected healthcare observations, construction decisions, family realities, and long-term adaptability into one practical system. And that's when this stopped being a search. It became a mission. Not because I wanted it to, but because I couldn't walk away from it. Even my wife agreed. The questions wouldn't leave me alone. The patterns wouldn't leave me alone. The opportunity wouldn't leave me alone. I kept seeing examples. I kept seeing families. I kept seeing situations where small decisions could have created meaningful improvements. And eventually something began taking shape, not overnight, not all at once, gradually, one observation at a time, one pattern at a time, one question at a time. What started as a son trying to help his parents slowly evolved into something much larger. And eventually that work became safe sizing. But before safe sizing could fully take shape, there was still one question I needed answered. If all these concepts existed, why wasn't there already a residential standard connecting them? And that's where we're going next. Hope you're enjoying it so far. Thank you. If all these concepts existed, why wasn't there already a residential standard connecting them? That question stayed with me for a very long time. And honestly, at first, I assumed the answer was simple. I assumed I just hadn't found it yet. Surely there had to be an existing framework. Surely there had to be an established residential standard that connected healthcare realities, construction practices, family needs, long-term adaptability, and environmental considerations. Surely somebody had already done this work. So I started looking, and what I found was interesting. I found accessibility, I found the ADA, I found universal design, I found aging in place, I found occupational therapy, I found healthcare research, I found construction best practices. I found valuable information everywhere I looked. And I want to be very clear about something. Every one of those disciplines contributed important ideas. Every one of them matters. Every one of them continues to matter. This isn't a story about somebody getting it wrong. It's a story about discovering that was still space between the existing pieces. Let's start with accessibility. Accessibility is critically important. Accessibility helps people access environments that might otherwise be difficult or impossible to use. It focuses on removing barriers. It focuses on entry. It focuses on access. And that's incredibly valuable. But as I continued studying homes, I realized I was asking a slightly different question. Not just, can somebody access the space? But how well does the space function once they're inside? That's a different conversation. Then I looked at ADA again, enormously important. ADA changed countless lives. ADA created opportunities that simply did not exist before, and the ADA established expectations that improved access throughout all of society. But ADA was never intended to be a comprehensive residential adaptability framework. That's not a criticism. That's simply acknowledging its purpose. ADA primarily addresses accessibility requirements in public and commercial environments. The homes I was studying presented different questions, different realities, different challenges. Then I looked at universal design, and I found many concepts I genuinely appreciated. Universal design encourages environments that work for a broad range of people. That's a valuable goal, a worthwhile goal, an important goal. But even there, I still found myself asking questions that extended beyond what I was reading, questions about healthcare, questions about caregiving, questions about long-term adaptation, questions about changing family dynamics, questions about environmental variables that evolved over time. The same thing happened when I studied aging in place. I found excellent information, practical information, helpful information, but once again, I found myself returning to the same observation. Many of these conversations began after a need was already identified, after a diagnosis, after an injury, after a change in circumstance, after a family recognized a problem, and then there's absolutely value in that. Excuse me. But my mind kept drifting somewhere else. It kept asking, what if we considered some of these realities earlier? What if we considered them during design? What if we considered them during construction? What if we considered them before a crisis arrived? Not because we expect a crisis, because life eventually changes. That question kept bringing me back to the same place, the home. The physical environment, the relationship between people and the spaces they inhabit. And the more I explored that relationship, the more another distinction began emerging. Accessibility and adaptability are not the same thing. They're related, but they're not identical. Accessibility often asks, can a person access this environment? Adaptability asks, can this environment continue supporting the person as life changes? Accessibility is essential. Adaptability builds upon it. But accessibility focuses on access. Adaptability focuses on long-term function. Accessibility focuses on how you enter a space and helps the space continue working as circumstances evolve. Both matter, both are valuable, but they're not the same conversation. That realization became increasingly important because I started noticing that many of the opportunities I was identifying weren't necessarily accessibility opportunities. They were adaptability opportunities, opportunities to preserve options, opportunities to preserve, opportunities to preserve functionality, preserve independence, opportunities to reduce future disruption, opportunities to create flexibility. And once I began viewing the problem through that lens, the gap became clearer. Healthcare was identifying risks. Construction was creating environments. Families were adapting in real time. Government programs were beginning to recognize environmental influences like CMS. Researchers were documenting outcomes, but there wasn't a common residential framework connecting all of those observations together, at least not one that I could find, and I looked. And that's when a realization began forming. The problem wasn't that information was missing, the information existed. The problem was the information lived in separate worlds. Healthcare had one conversation, construction had another, accessibility had another, government policy had another. Families were trying to navigate all of them simultaneously. Something needed to connect those conversations. Something needed to create a common language. Something needed to bridge the gap. And slowly, almost without me realizing it, in a very true sense, a framework began taking shape. Not because I sat down one day and decided to create a standard, because the questions kept leading me there. Every road seemed to point in the same direction. Every observation seemed connected. Every example seemed connected. Every family story seemed connected. The pieces weren't random. The pieces formed a pattern. And once I saw the pattern, I couldn't unsee it. What started as research became organization. What started as observations became structure. What started as questions became a framework. And eventually that framework became the foundation of what I now call the proprietary and patent pending safe sizing standard. Not because the previous disciplines failed, because they contributed. Every one of them contributed. The proprietary safe sizing standard simply attempts to connect those contributions through the lens of residential adaptability to create a practical framework that helps families, healthcare professionals, contractors, designers, architects, and communities speak the same language. And as that framework continued evolving, another challenge became obvious. The number of variables involved was enormous, far larger than any single person could comfortably organize. That's when I realized that I needed help. Not human help, mathematical help. Cha-ching! Just kidding. Old register. Cha-ching. That's not very funny. Keep hanging in there because I'm hoping I'm resonating with some of y'all. The number of variables involved was enormous, far larger than any single person could comfortably organize. That's when I realized that I needed help. Not human help, mathematical help. Because by this point, I wasn't looking at a single problem anymore. I was looking at hundreds of interconnected variables, maybe thousands. Every family was different. Every home was different. Every diagnosis was different. Every life circumstance was different. Every construction project was different. And yet patterns kept appearing. The challenge wasn't finding information. The challenge was organizing information, connecting information, evaluating information, understanding relationships between variables that don't normally live in the same conversation. That's where XAiQ enters the story. Now, before I go any further, again, I'm telepromptering here. I want to make something very clear. XAiQ did not create safe sizing. It's an AI software platform that I developed within open source AI. But artificial intelligence did not invent this idea. AI did not discover my parents. It did not discover CMS or Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services. It did not discover accessibility. It didn't discover adaptability. Artificial intelligence did not discover caregiving realities. Those things already existed. The problem already existed. The need already existed. The opportunity already existed. What artificial intelligence helped me do was organize all the variables. And that's an important distinction because I think a lot of people hear the letters AI and immediately imagine a machine inventing something all by itself. That is not what happened here. Think about it this way. Imagine trying to evaluate a home. Now imagine trying to evaluate that home through the lens of age, mobility, balance, vision, strength, recovery, caregiving, executive function, household size, layout, lighting, storage, bathroom configuration, kitchen configuration, entry and bath paths, temporary injuries, permanent disabilities, future flexibility, family dynamics, and hundreds of other variables. Now try imagining doing that. Imagine trying to evaluate how those variables interact with one another, not independently, but together. That's where the challenge begins, because the real world is truly messy. Life doesn't arrive at one variable at a time. Life arrives as combinations. The person recovering from surgery may also be caring for an aging parent. The family supporting a child with special needs may also be caring for a grandparent. The veteran may also be navigating mobility challenges. The spouse may be also serving as a caregiver. The variables overlap. They interact. They influence one another. And the more I studied those interactions, the more I realized I needed a way to organize them, not replace human judgment, support human judgment. That's a very different goal. Healthcare professionals use data every day. Construction professionals use data every day. Researchers use data every day. The question wasn't whether data matters. The question was how to organize it in a meaningful way. That's what XAiQ began doing for me. It became a way to identify variables, categorize variables, weight variables, compare variables, and explore relationships between variables that might otherwise be difficult to see. Not because the information was hidden, because there was so much of it. And that's one of the things that fascinated me and still does to this day. It's like magic. The more variables I added, the more patterns emerged. Certain environmental features appeared repeatedly. Certain risks appeared repeatedly at a statistically significant level. Certain opportunities appeared repeatedly. Certain design considerations appeared repeatedly. The same themes kept surfacing. Different families, different homes, different circumstances, but often remarkably similar patterns. That doesn't mean every family needs the same solution. Far from it. In fact, one of the most important lessons XAiQ reinforced was exactly the opposite. Every family is unique. Every home is unique. Every situation is unique. The goal was never to create a one-size-fits-all answer. The goal was to create a better way of understanding complexity, a better way of identifying opportunities, a better way of recognizing relationships, and support decision-making. That's why I often describe XAiQ as an analysis tool or strategic intelligence engine rather than a decision tool. It helps me organize information, helps reveal patterns, helps quantify variables, but people still make decisions. Families still make decisions. Healthcare professionals still make decisions. Builders still make decisions. Designers still make decisions. The human element remains not only present, but essential. And honestly, I think that's one of the biggest misconceptions people have about AI in general. Many assume AI replaces people. I don't see it that way, at least not in this context. I see it as a terrific, amazing resource, a calculator on a much larger scale, a way to process information faster, a way to identify relationships faster, a way to evaluate possibilities faster. The judgment still ultimately belongs to the people. The wisdom belongs to the people. The compassion belongs to the people. The lived experience or experiences still belong to the people. XAiQ simply helps organize complexity, and complexity is exactly what we're dealing with. Because by now I was looking at healthcare construction, accessibility, adaptability, caregiving, government policy, family dynamics, environmental design, risk reduction, future flexibility, and all those concepts are beginning to converge. The framework was taking shape. The variables were taking shape. The analysis was taking shape. But something even more important was becoming clear. Safe sizing wasn't just sitting inside healthcare, and it wasn't just sitting inside construction. It was sitting somewhere in between at the intersection. And once I recognized that intersection, everything started making more sense. And I hope that this video is still making sense, because I'm still nervous. Palms are sweaty. Mom spaghetti. Safe sizing wasn't just sitting inside healthcare, and it wasn't just sitting inside construction. It was sitting somewhere in between at the intersection. And once I recognized that intersection, everything started making more sense. Because for most of my career, healthcare and construction felt like two separate worlds, related certainly, but separate. Healthcare focused on people, construction focused on buildings. Healthcare focused on outcomes, construction focused on environments. Healthcare focused on identifying needs, construction focused on creating solutions. Both mattered, but they rarely seemed to speak the same language, at least not consistently. And yet, the more I studied adaptability, the more obvious the connection became. Healthcare spends an enormous amount of time understanding how people function, how they recover, how they age, how they adapt, how they navigate injury, illness, disability, caregiving responsibilities, and changing circumstances. Healthcare studies people. Construction, on the other hand, spends an enormous amount of time shaping environments, walls, doorways, bathrooms, kitchens, lighting, layouts, entrances, exits, storage, circulation. Construction creates the spaces where daily life occurs. On one discipline studies, excuse me, the one discipline studies people and the other discipline creates environments. And eventually I found myself asking a very simple question. What happens when those two conversations finally meet? What happens when healthcare observations begin influencing construction decisions? What happens when construction decisions begin supporting healthcare objectives? What happens when both groups start looking at the same environment through a shared lens? That's where things started becoming interesting, because suddenly the home wasn't simply a building anymore, and it wasn't simply a healthcare discussion anymore. It became both. The home became the meeting place, the place where healthcare realities and construction realities intersect. Think about it. Where does recovery happen? Where does caregiving happen? Where does independence happen? Where do daily routines happen? Where do families adapt? Where do people spend most of their lives outside of work? For most people, the answer is simple: home. Not the doctor's office, not the hospital, not the therapy clinic, home. And yet, for decades, many of these conversations occurred separately. Healthcare professionals identified needs, construction professionals modified environments, families attempted to connect the dots after the fact, and everybody was working hard, but the conversations often remained fragmented. That fragmentation is what caught my attention, because fragmentation creates friction. Families end up navigating multiple systems, multiple professionals, multiple perspectives, multiple priorities, sometimes successfully, sometimes not. And when life becomes complicated, that fragmentation becomes even more difficult to navigate. The more I looked at it, the more I realized something. The challenge wasn't a lack of expertise. There were experts everywhere. The challenge wasn't a lack of caring. There were caring people everywhere. The challenge wasn't a lack of effort. People were working incredibly hard. The challenge was integration, connecting observations, connecting disciplines, connecting information, people, creating a common language. That's where safe sizing began to find its place. Not replacing healthcare, not replacing construction, not replacing design, not replacing architecture or caregiving. It's connecting them, helping them communicate, helping them collaborate, helping them view the same environment through a shared framework. And when that happens, something important occurs. The conversation becomes proactive instead of reactive. Instead of waiting for a problem to appear, we begin asking questions earlier. Instead of waiting for a crisis, we begin considering possibilities. Instead of asking how to respond after life changes, we begin asking how to prepare before life changes. Not because we're fearful, because we're practical. That's a very different mindset. One of the things that became increasingly clear throughout this process was that healthcare and construction actually complement each other remarkably well. Healthcare identifies risk. Construction creates solutions. Healthcare observes outcomes. Construction modifies environments. Healthcare studies human function. Construction shapes physical function. Neither discipline is complete by itself. Together, however, they become extraordinarily powerful. That's the intersection. And once you begin seeing the world through that lens, you start recognizing opportunities literally everywhere. Opportunities to improve functionality, opportunities to improve independence or freedom, opportunities to improve caregiving, flexibility, quality of life. Not through massive changes either, through thoughtful changes, through intentional decisions like 2x6s behind the walls. It's through purposeful environments, considerations that that phrase keeps coming back because it matters. The environment participates in life whether we acknowledge it or not. The environment influences behavior. The environment influences convenience. The environment influences safety. The environment influences independence. The environment influences stress. The environment influences freedom. And once healthcare, construction, and analysis begin evaluating those influences together, a clearer picture emerges. A picture that is larger than any one discipline, a picture that is larger than any one diagnosis, larger than any one project, a picture focused on people, families, homes, and long-term functionality. By this point, the framework was beginning to feel complete. The pieces were connecting, the relationships were becoming clearer, but the purpose was becoming clearer. There was still one challenge, though. How do you explain all of this simply? How do you reduce healthcare, construction, adaptability, environmental design, caregiving realities, and variable analysis into something people can actually understand? Eventually, I found myself returning to four simple statements that captured the entire framework better than anything else I had written. And those four statements became the foundation for everything that followed. So stay with me, and we'll get into that right now. Eventually, I found myself returning to four simple statements that captured the entire framework better than anything else I had written. And those four statements became the foundation for everything that followed. Because after all the research, after all the conversations, after all the construction experience and healthcare experience, after all the family experiences, after all the analysis, I realized something. Most people don't need a 50-page explanation. Most people don't need a technical framework. Most people don't need a white paper. They need a way to understand the concept, a way to remember it, a way to explain it, and eventually everything began condensing into four ideas. Healthcare identifies risk. Construction creates solutions. XAiQ, or XAiQ, quantifies variables. Safe sizing brings them together. That's the framework. Simple, but powerful. So let's start with healthcare, because healthcare spends an enormous amount of time identifying risk: falls, injuries, recovery challenges, caregiving challenges, mobility limitations, vision changes, cognitive changes, functional changes. Healthcare professionals spend their careers observing patterns, studying outcomes, recognizing risks, trying to improve quality of life. Healthcare sees the problem. Healthcare sees the challenge. Healthcare identifies the risk, but healthcare doesn't usually build houses. That's not its role. Now let's look at construction. Construction creates solutions. It shapes environments. It builds the places where life happens. Construction determines layouts. It determines access. It determines circulation. It determines how spaces function. Construction has the ability to physically alter the environment. Construction sees the solution, but construction doesn't always have access to the same observation healthcare sees. And that's not a criticism. It's just simple reality. Different disciplines see different things. That's why bringing those perspectives together becomes so valuable. Now let's talk about XAiQ, because by this point we've already discussed why it became necessary. The variables were overwhelming. There were too many moving parts, too many interactions, too many relationships and possibilities. But XAiQ helps organize those variables. It helps quantify relationships. It helps identify patterns, helps evaluate possibilities, helps process complexity. But it does not replace people. It supports people. That's the distinction. Healthcare identifies risk. Construction creates solution. XAiQ quantifies variables, and then safe sizing brings them together. That's the role of the proprietary safe sizing standard. It's integration, connection, translation, coordination. Safe sizing creates a framework where those conversations can occur in the same place. The healthcare conversation, the construction conversation, the family conversation, the adaptability conversation, the environmental conversation, the analysis conversation, all connected, all working towards the same goal: improving functionality, improving independence, improving flexibility, quality of life. Excuse me. Now, one of the things I find fascinating is how often people assume innovation must be complicated. Sometimes it is, like AI. Sometimes it isn't. Sometimes innovation is simply recognizing a relationship that already existed. Sometimes innovation is connecting ideas that were already sitting in the room together. Sometimes innovation is creating a common language. That's what safe sizing feels like to me. Not creating something from nothing, connecting things that were already there. Healthcare was already there. Construction was already there. Families were already there. Caregiving was already there. Accessibility was there. Adaptability already there. The pieces existed. The framework simply helped organize them. And when those pieces begin working together, something remarkable happens. The conversation changes. Instead of asking, what product do we need, we start asking, what outcome are we trying to achieve? Instead of asking, what modification do we need to install, We start asking, what problem are we solving? Instead of asking, what diagnosis are we dealing with? We start asking, how can the environment better support this person and this family? That's a much different conversation, if you can imagine that. It's possible. I created the system that allows that conversation to at least initiate a more practical conversation and ultimately a more human conversation. Because at the end of the day, this isn't about healthcare and it really isn't about construction. It isn't about artificial intelligence. Those are tools and very important ones, valuable ones at this point. Necessary, certainly, but they're still just tools. The real subject has always been people trying to live their lives, trying to care for loved ones, people trying to remain independent and free, people trying to navigate change and trying to preserve their freedom. That's the real story. And when I finally realized that, another simple truth became obvious. All of these conversations eventually lead back to the same place, the place where life actually happens, the place where families gather, the place where caregiving occurs, the place where independence is tested, the place where freedom is experienced, the place we call home. That's very emotional. Okay, stop. The home is where all of these conversations eventually lead, and that's back to the same place. The place where life actually happens, the place where families gather, the place where caregiving occurs, the place where independence is tested, the place where freedom is experienced, the place we call home. And that's something I don't think I fully appreciated when this journey began. Like many people, I thought of a home primarily as shelter, a place to sleep, a place to eat, a place to store your belongings, a place to raise a family, a place to come back to after a long day. All of those things are true. But over the last few years, I've come to believe a home is much more than that. A home is where life unfolds. It's where ordinary moments happen. The moments that don't make the headlines, the moments that don't appear in photographs, the moments that rarely get discussed, the moments that quietly become our lives. Making coffee in the morning, walking to the mailbox, bringing groceries inside, reading in a favorite chair, helping a child with homework, tucking a child into bed, sitting on the porch, watching a ball game, having dinner together, recovering after surgery, caring for a loved one, saying goodbye to someone you love. Life happens at home. The ordinary moments, the difficult moments, the beautiful moments, the painful moments, the unforgettable moments, all of them. And that's why I eventually stopped viewing home simply as a structure. Because structures don't tell the whole story. People tell the story. Families tell the story. Experiences tell the story. The home simply becomes the setting, the stage upon which life unfolds. And when you begin looking at homes that way, something changes. You stop evaluating them solely by square footage. You stop evaluating them solely by finishes. You stop evaluating them solely by curb appeal. Those things still matter. Of course they matter, but they stop being the entire conversation. You begin asking different questions. How does this home support the people who live here? How does this home function during ordinary life? How does this home function during difficult seasons? What does this home support? How does this home support independence? How does this home support caregiving? What does this home support, or does this home support recovery? Does it support the family? Because ultimately, that's what we're really talking about here. Support, not perfection, not prediction, support. A home that supports the people who live inside it. And the more I thought about it, the more I realized that all of the concepts we've discussed throughout this episode eventually point towards something larger. Freedom. Not freedom in a political sense, not freedom in an abstract sense, freedom in a deeply personal sense. The freedom to remain independent, the freedom to make your own decisions, the freedom to maintain your routines, the freedom to continue participating in your own life, the freedom to remain connected to your community, the freedom to remain connected to your family, to remain connected to the place you call home. That's the kind of freedom I'm talking about. And once I realized that, I started seeing something else. Healthcare identifies risk. Construction creates solutions. XAiQ, or XAiQ, quantifies variables. Safe sizing brings them together. But all of those things are still serving something larger. They're serving freedom. They're serving independence. They're serving dignity, quality of life. The framework matters, but the outcome matters more. The analysis matters, but the people matter more. The home matters, but the people that are in the home matter even more. That's where the conversation becomes deeply personal because every one of us understands home differently. Every one of us has memories attached to a home or a house. Every one of us has experiences attached to a home. Every one of us has people attached to a home. And those connections are powerful, sometimes far more powerful than we realize. That's why so many people want to remain in their homes. It's not always about the building. It's about what the building represents. It represents memories, represents family. It represents identity. It represents comfort and familiarity, life. And when life becomes difficult, those things become even more important. The more I studied adaptability, the more convinced I became that homes should support those connections whenever possible. Not because every person should stay in their home, every home forever. That's not realistic. Sometimes moving is the right decision. Sometimes transitioning is the right decision. Sometimes circumstances require change. But when people want to remain independent, when people want to remain connected, when people want to remain engaged in the life they've built, the environment should help them, not work against them. That's the heart of safe sizing. Not construction, not healthcare, not technology. People, families, freedom. And eventually, all of those ideas condensed into a single statement, a statement that became the foundation of everything else. Healthcare is the why. Construction is the how. The home is the where. Freedom is the destination. I like that. That sounds great. Healthcare is the why. Construction is the how. The home is the where. Freedom is the destination. The first time those words came together, I knew I'd found something important. Not because they sounded clever, not because they sounded marketable, because they felt true. They captured everything I'd been trying to say, everything I'd been studying, everything I'd been observing, everything that I had been experiencing. 4 simple statements. One destination, freedom. And the more I thought about that word, the more I realized how differently people define it. For some people, freedom means driving a car. For others, freedom means preparing a meal. For others, freedom means taking a shower without assistance. For others, freedom means remaining connected to friends and family. For others, freedom means staying in the home they've spent decades building a life inside. Freedom is personal. Freedom looks different for every person. But regardless of how we define it, most of us understand it immediately when we begin losing it. That's when its value becomes obvious. The ability to do something independently, the ability to make our own decisions, the ability to participate in our own lives, the ability to choose. Choice. That word keeps returning throughout this entire conversation. Choice. The choice to remain independent, the choice to adapt, the choice to recover, the choice to care for someone else, the choice to remain engaged in life. Choice is one of the greatest gifts adaptability can preserve. And that's the reality. And that's really what safe sizing has been about from the very beginning. Not predicting the future, not preventing every problem, not creating perfect homes, preserving choices, preserving opportunities, preserving flexibility, preserving options. Because when life changes, and it will, the families with options are often in a better position to navigate those changes. Now, I want to be very clear about something. Safe sizing is not a guarantee. No framework can guarantee outcomes. No design can eliminate every risk. No home can solve every challenge. Life is simply too complicated for that. People are too unique for that. Families are too unique for that. Excuse me. But that doesn't mean preparation lacks value. It means preparation has limits. And within those limits, preparation matters. Thoughtful decisions matter. Intentional decisions matter. Purposeful environmental considerations matter. The environment matters. The home matters. The people matter. And if you've listened this far, I hope you've noticed something. We've spent very little time talking about products, very little time talking about gadgets, very little time talking about technology. That's intentional because safe sizing was never created around products. It was created around people. Products may come and go. Technology will continue changing. Construction methods will evolve. Healthcare will evolve, artificial intelligence will evolve, but people will still be people. Families will still be families, and life will still be life. And homes will still matter. That's why I believe this conversation is important. Not because safe sizing is important, because the people safe sizing is intended to serve are important. The aging parent, the spouse, the caregiver, the veteran, the child with special needs, the family navigating uncertainty, the individual recovering from an injury, the person trying to remain independent, the person trying to preserve dignity, the person trying to remain connected to the life they've built. Those people matter. And if this framework helps even a small number of families think differently about their homes, then every hour spent building it was worth it. Because at its core, safe sizing is not a construction conversation. It's not a healthcare conversation. It's not an artificial intelligence conversation. It's a human conversation, a conversation about how people live, a conversation about how people adapt, a conversation about how people care for one another, a conversation about how environments can either support those efforts or complicate them, and ultimately a conversation about freedom, the freedom to live, the freedom to participate, the freedom to remain connected, the freedom to choose, the freedom to continue writing your own story for as long as possible. Because when you strip everything else away, the framework, the analysis, the construction, the terminology, the standards, the policies, the data, the research, what remains is something very simple: people, families, homes, and freedom. Which brings us to the final thought I want to leave with you. So if you've hung in there long enough, thank you. When you strip everything else away, what remains is something very simple: people, families, homes, and freedom. If you stayed with me through this first episode, I want to sincerely thank you, because I know your time is valuable. I know there are countless podcasts you could be listening to, and I know this conversation may be different than what you may have expected. The truth is, safe sizing began as a search to better understand problems I was seeing in my own family, a search to better understand the relationship between healthcare, construction, and the environments we live in every day, a search to better understand how homes can either support independence or unintentionally create obstacles. But over time, that search became something more. It became a framework, it became a mission, and it eventually became a business. Today, safe sizing is more than a podcast. It's more than an idea. It's more than research. It's a real-world effort to help families think differently about the place they call home. That can mean evaluating an existing home. That can mean planning a renovation. That can mean helping a family prepare for changing circumstances. That can mean consulting during the design of a new home. That can mean identifying opportunities to improve functionality, flexibility, and long-term adaptability. Sometimes the answer is a remodel. Sometimes the answer is a design adjustment. Sometimes the answer is simply awareness. Sometimes the answer is realizing that a small change today could make a meaningful difference years from now. And sometimes the answer is discovering that your home is already serving you better than you realized. The point is not to sell fear. The point is not to predict disaster. The point is not to convince everyone that they need to spend money. The point is to help people make informed decisions and provide them the tools. Because informed decisions create options, and options create freedom. So if something you've heard during this episode resonates with you, here's my invitation. Start a conversation. Talk with your spouse. Talk with your parents. Talk with your children. Talk with your mate or your partner. Walk through your home. Look at it differently. Ask a simple question. Will this home still work when life changes? Not if, when. If that question leads you to additional questions, reach out to me, please. I am a contractor as well. Just because I'm doing this, I actually do work with my hands. And I would be more than happy to talk with you about your project. We're happy to have conversations. We're happy to evaluate ideas. We're happy to look at homes. We're happy to discuss remodeling projects. We're happy to discuss new construction. We're happy to help families think through possibilities. Because at the end of the day, this has never been about creating a perfect home. It's about helping people create homes that work better for the people living inside them. And that's what this podcast is ultimately about. Not construction, not healthcare, not technology, people living real lives inside real homes. Now, before we go, I want to leave you with one final thought. Over the course of our lives, many things change. Our circumstances change, our health changes, our families change, our homes change, our priorities change, we change. That's part of being human. That's part of life. But there's one thing that remains remarkably consistent: the desire to remain independent, the desire to remain connected, the desire to remain engaged in our own lives, the desire to remain free. And that's why the phrase "at the heart of safe sizing" means so much to me personally, because after everything I've learned, after everything I've seen, after everything I've experienced, I've come to believe something very simple. Many things in life get old, but freedom never gets old. Thank you for spending this time with me. My name is Eric Myers, and this has been the Safe Sizing Podcast. I'll see you next time. Thank you.